So I'm going to try something different this evening because we're a nice, intimate group. And because I am lucky to be able to say that Alyse is a friend of mine, and I know her well enough to know that she would appreciate this method of starting the evening tonight. But rather than me introduce Alyse to you, maybe we can all introduce ourselves, including ending with you, because you're probably going to talk about your career and your work. So I'll start. I'm Ellen Toscano. I'm the director of NYU Florence.
I'm Jordan Smith. I'm a junior at NYU Gallatin. I'm studying applying artistic imagination to radical political and social change.
I'm Nydia Corona. I'm studying in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm majoring in social and cultural analysis with a minor in law and society.
I'm Taylor Williams. I'm a junior in Steinhardt studying media culture and communications.
Hi, I'm Alyse Ercoli. I'm a president of Women NGO, Differenza Donna, a women age anti-violence shelter, and we work against gender discrimination.
Hi, my name is Yana. I go to New York University Abu Dhabi and I study computer science.
Brendan Hogan. I am a professor in the Liberal Studies program and I teach political philosophy and democratic theory.
I'm Emily Maffa, and I'm a freshman in Liberal Studies.
I'm Connie Vivoli. I'm not a freshman. I am a staff member at NYU Florence here, Office of Student Life.
I'm Marjana Listvan, and I'm a lingerie designer.
I'm Jack Delano. I am a sophomore at NYU Abu Dhabi, majoring in political science and legal studies.
Hi, I'm Diana, and I'm from Hong Kong, and I'm also from NYU Abu Dhabi. I'm doing a major in literature and also social research and public policy. I also run an NGO, and I'm looking for a mentor.
Great, wonderful.
I've been running it for since I was 16,
Wow.
and it's an educational NGO that seeks to bridge the gap between the educational quality that privileged kids and underprivileged kids receive in Hong Kong.
So I'm into female empowerment in STEM, and I'm organizing a dialogue upcoming Monday that's called Empowering Women in STEM.
I am organizing a dialogue called Transforming Fashion. It's an all-day conference about how gender is constructed in the fashion industry and how that can be used for transgender activism.
Thank you. My name is Maria Donata Rinaldi. I work for an Italian NGO and I'm now responsible for the training department.
Hi, I'm Lucia Ducci. I'm an Italian teacher. I collaborate with Stanford University here in Florence.
Interesting spring afternoon or evening. So I'm Alyse Nelson, thrilled to be back. We had a wonderful partnership with Ellen and with Villa La Pietra a few years ago, and I would love to reignite that. And so I'm hoping that today we can certainly have a discussion about the work that we do at Vital Voices, and I want to share with you some of the really interesting lessons that we've learned from our work. But also I'm hoping we can have a really good discussion about what might make sense for a future collaboration between Vital Voices and Villa La Pietra or NYU here. Do you want to introduce yourself before we...
Deborah Spini, I think I've been teaching here, I'm sorry to say something like the past 19 years, to be honest. I started whilst I was in primary school, of course. It was a special program. And what else? Teaching social foundations by training political philosopher.
Well, you know, the first thing I'd like to, I feel like this is one term. Is that okay? The first thing I'd like to say is that I think it's a really, really interesting time for these issues. I've worked on the advancement of women and girls for 22 years now. I actually got my start going to the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China. Anyone in this room remember that? 1995? Some of you, were you born yet? I don't know.
I was.
You were, okay. Anyway, but I was, the students around the table, I was about your age. I was 21 years old. Now imagine a time when there was no technology, okay? There's not really the internet, just slight internet connections. There is no way to find out about women's issues. You know, so you can read books about women's issues in the United States, but you wouldn't be able to access books in other countries. There is no great New York Times piece by Nicholas Kristof telling you about what's going on for women around the world. There's really no way to find out about global women's issues. You know, social media, technology, that does not exist in the way that we think about it today, 22 years ago, right, in 1995. So I sort of randomly stumble into, in college in Boston, hearing about this thing called the UN Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China. And there's going to be 55,000 women, potentially, coming from 200 countries around the world. And immediately I'm like, I have to go. I don't know how I'm gonna get there and exactly where it's gonna be. Oh, it's in Beijing, in China. I tell my dad, because I don't know about all of you, but if I tell my dad I'm gonna do something, I actually have to do it. Anyway, so I tell him and he says, Beijing, Texas? What do you mean, Beijing, China? You don't speak Chinese, you know, what are you gonna do? I ended up going. I didn't actually get the right kind of visa, you know, and all these challenges, but I was determined to go, and the more that I kept being told that I couldn't get the right kind of visa and I didn't have the right kind of paperwork, the more sort of dug in I felt about my voice will be heard. And I went, and when I got there, I realized something. I realized that all these women had come from all over the globe, and they came there to fight. And here I had come to learn. And I started to doubt, like, why did I want to come all these miles away to learn about global women's issues? You know, I know that my mother grew up in a time where she wanted to be an architect. And people said to her, well, no one's ever going to hire a woman to build a strong structure. So you can be a teacher, you can be a nurse. And her father told her that as well. So she believed them, right? Obviously, many women did not believe, you know, when people would say that to them. But I think because her father told her and she had a lot of respect for her father, she believed that. So I grew up with, you know, that sentiment, knowing my mother was this courageous, amazing woman, but yet at the same time, she had limits. And I really went to that conference wanting to know, what is the situation for women around the world? What is the situation for this world in which I'm, you know, coming of age in, that is, you know, everybody's talking about globalization now, everybody's talking about the internet. It had not really taken off in the way that we think about it, obviously. But I knew, okay, I'm going to actually go out in the world, in a world that's going to be very global. And so what does that mean? And I was very interested in women's issues. I went to Emerson College in Boston for undergrad. And I took every single class with the word woman in the title, because I was just so desperate to learn about these issues. But obviously had to go, you know, halfway or all the way around the world, you know, to China to learn about these issues. And I remember I was there and I saw this sign that said, "Stop trafficking in women." And I thought, what is that, trafficking in women? What is that, a disease, like in women? What is that? And you think about it, all of us around the table, I'm sure, know, have heard about, you know, read about, know about human trafficking, right? You know, modern day slavery. But back then, you know, there were no laws in any country. You know, I mean, there are slavery laws, obviously, anti-slavery laws, but there were no laws that said that we need to protect the victims because we don't want to victimize the victims twice. You know, so if someone is in a country illegally, you know, we just throw them in prison and treat them like basically they were a criminal for being there illegally when actually they were taken there against their will. So I'm learning about all these issues and I'm thinking, you know, why did I want to come? Why did I want to be here? And on the last day of the conference, I got my answer. Hillary Clinton was coming to speak. And, you know, this is 1995, so she's the First Lady of the United States. There is a, you know, as you probably know, she gave that famous speech there, women's rights are human rights are women's rights. And I know many of you, you know, might think, well, why was that such a big deal? Like, yeah, of course, you know, women's rights are human rights. But back then, I mean, that was really, really radical to say in a gathering like that. Because it was basically saying that all the same rights that men have, women should have those same rights. That all people, you know, no matter your background, your class, your sexual orientation, everyone should have those same rights. And so she made a very, very dramatic speech. And when I listened to her speak, I realized that here's a woman who, you know, yes, she's the First Lady of the United States, but she really doesn't have like a job description that says fly halfway around the world and give this really powerful speech. And in fact, a lot of people in her husband's own administration did not want her to travel. I mean, there's a really funny movie that you should bring here called Once and For All about that conference and what happened and how she went and how difficult it was for her to go. But she spoke, and I realized as I was listening to her speak that I did not have the same sort of powerful voice that she had, but I had a voice. And that so many women around the world don't. And I realized right there something that I think defined my career path, and that was really that I wanted to seek power to empower those that had no power, or seek voice to bring voice to those people and those issues that had no voice. That's what I felt like. Somehow I'd been called, or whatever you want to say, the gut was telling me, you need to go, you need to be part of this, you need to learn about these issues. And I somehow took this sort of leap of faith to go and be there. And that was really what I took home, was you have to share this, because people don't know about these issues. And as we become a more global world, we need to be aware of what's going on around the world. So I came back from that conference. I invited some people from the White House who worked for Mrs. Clinton at the time. They actually recruited me to come down, and my first job was working for Hillary at the White House on global women's issues, and beginning to think about how do we implement the document that all these governments signed on to in Beijing into into U.S. law. But also, how do we make sure that these issues are respected around the world? And that's where Vital Voices began. And that's sort of, where my story and my path began. And the reason I mention this, and the reason I think it's important, is that I feel really strongly that if you want to lead, or even if you want to make change in this world, you have to know what you are about and what drives you first. And I think for a lot of people, it is an experience, or a series of experiences that sort of equals up to something. Maybe it's a repetition that keeps happening in your life. But hopefully you find that driving force, that sort of true north. And the reason why I think that's so important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but the reason I think that is so important is because there are a lot of distractions right now in the world, and I think that people are really craving authentic and authenticity in their leaders, right? I mean, it's probably one of the reasons why we had such an upset in the U.S. elections, because people wanted something that wasn't political. They wanted something that was real and authentic, even though it was something that maybe they didn't even agree with, but they wanted that sort of realness, right? And I think that, as a leader, you can't be real if you don't know what you're about. It's the thing that, ultimately should inspire you, but it should also humble you. And so I just wonder, before I kind of get into talking about Vital Voices and some of these lessons, I wonder if anyone around the table, if you're connecting with what I'm saying and thinking, yeah, I've had a similar experience like that. And I know you started an NGO when you were 16, and my first question was, why did you start that NGO? It was really interesting to me, because I think that people who set out to make change make a choice, right? So you could have taken this path or this path. Something made you start this NGO. So what was it? What was the experience that happened to you?
Part of this program called UNICEF Young Envoys. So I was part of the UNICEF Hong Kong Young Envoys program. So I went on a couple of mission trips. When I was in Vietnam, I remember clearly that I was 15, and it was a moment that really defined the way that I see things and the kind of things that I want to do in the future. And what happened was that we happened to be at a maternal hospital that was set up by UNICEF to provide maternal health care. And on the bed, I was helping the doctor do really basic checks. And there lay a 15-year-old girl who was literally my age, and she was holding another baby in her hand, and she was doing another checkup. So she had been a victim of child marriage. And it just really struck me that I'm so privileged and I'm so lucky to be in Hong Kong, to have the chance and the education to chase after my dreams, but I could have very well been that other girl lying on the bed who will have to take care of her husband and her kids and sacrifice her own dreams. So that was a moment when I realized I wanted to continue making change. And so there's 2 NGOs I'm involved with. The first one is education in terms of raising the quality of education for underprivileged kids in Hong Kong. And the other one is to do with Chinese girls in farming villages in Guangdong. It's because I think that education is such an important component to helping a girl step out of the kind of defined boxes that they're given. So many girls in China, they are unable to progress with their education beyond middle school. And because the government does not fund their high school education, so even the most talented and the brightest and most promising young women, they lose out on this education, and they have to go into factories, and then they start getting married, and there they are, no social mobility there. So I work with NGOs that fundraise for these girls and send them to high school so that they can at least have the high school education to get into service-based jobs that are way better than, say, factory jobs or farming jobs in terms of helping them progress in the world. And they affect change among other women. And because in China, there's there's a concept or a tradition that where they think that they prefer the male child, so they prefer to send males to school instead of females to school. And so we're really trying to change that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was a moment.
Phenomenal work. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, one of the things that I feel about what I call in my life a driving force, right? Or it's really your mission, your own personal mission, is that you can fulfill that in a number of different ways. You're currently fulfilling it through this NGO. I'm fulfilling it through Vital Voices, but I feel as though that's the driving force of my life. And I think that, in difficult times, it is that true north, right? That reminds you, this is why I'm doing this. And one of the things that I think has not always been what leadership has been about, but I think more and more it's what people are looking for in leaders, is that motivation. Where does the motivation to lead come from? It's not just sort of seeking power for the sake of power. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you today is some of the lessons that we've learned in leadership from women around the world that we've worked with. So a little bit about Vital Voices. We were started 20 years ago. We're this year celebrating 2 decades. And when we began, it was really off the inspiration that Hillary Clinton had coming out of the Beijing Women's Conference, and really recognizing that wherever she'd go, traveling around the world as First Lady, women were not at the table. So she knew that women were leading change in their communities. She knew, for example, that 2 women in Northern Ireland had won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1976, yet when her husband was involved in helping with and brokering the Good Friday Peace Accords in Northern Ireland, there were no women at those peace negotiation tables until 2 kind of busted their way in. But anyway, and so, she knew that, maybe there's an opportunity where I, as the First Lady of the United States, could really use my voice to bring women's voices to the table. So Vital Voices really began as, quite frankly, just a series of U.S. government-supported conferences around the world, working with our embassies, working with other governments, to bring women leaders, to identify them and bring them together. And they were leaders in government and civil society, also human rights leaders, and those who were working to end various forms of violence against women and human trafficking, and also women who are working to really lift communities out of poverty through social enterprises or, just interesting, entrepreneurial ventures. And so we really began over those first years just collecting and meeting with women. And then at the end of the Clinton administration, we thought that was going to be the end of Vital Voices. But a number of women who had come to various gatherings came to us and said, you can't end this, because women are not connected globally. We don't have a global network, and there is such a need for us as activists to come together because we don't know anyone like us in our country or community. But you introduced us to people, which made us realize that we weren't crazy. We were actually genius, what we were trying to do. And so we need to continue to have your support. And so we pulled together a group of those women, and we decided to become a nonprofit or non-governmental organization coming out of that. And you may remember at that time, Hillary Clinton was running for a seat in the Senate in New York. And so she immediately knew this had to be bipartisan. This wasn't about Republican or Democrat, or this is about, advancing women and girls around the world, and that there must be people on either sides of the aisle who can get behind this. So she reached out and engaged K. Bailey Hutchison. And to this day, we've always been very much about bipartisanship. But I have to say, one of the things that I'm really struggling with right now is, are we about the issues that we work on first and what we care about, or are we about being bipartisan? Because right now, those two things don't necessarily, there isn't a lot of synergy, let's say, right now in those two things. So it's a difficult time, quite frankly, to be advocating for women, but also trying to be the big tent that brings in everyone and cares about everyone's voice in this fight. So what we do now as a nonprofit, we became a nonprofit in 2000. What we do is we really search the world for women with a daring vision for change. These days, what we are more than anything is almost like a venture capital firm. If you can imagine, we're totally nonprofit. We're not taking a piece of any person's organization or company. We're finding the people who have the brilliant ideas, the breakthrough ideas. Women who are leading a shelter for victims or survivors of human trafficking in India. This woman in particular has rescued 8,000 women and children. And we're supporting her because she's supporting all these people, but who's supporting her? Nobody. And so that's what we do. We come in and support her and figure out, what does she need to take her vision to scale? Now, this is really different than a lot of nonprofit organizations or charity organizations, because most places, when you think about, development work, it's about communities, or it's about the development, international development community going in and serving a purpose, right? Delivering, being a service provider. It's not about going into a community and finding the leaders who are already doing it in that community and investing in them, right? Think about most of the organizations that that work in the development space. It's about delivering a service directly, rather than saying, actually, there's people on the ground who are delivering it. There are people there who, know the solutions much better than we do. We actually, are totally outside this culture. We really ought to look to them and really invest in them. So that's what we do. It is very different. We also understand something very fundamental, that change doesn't happen overnight. And that's, I think, something that, quite frankly, is a bit of a challenge in this, 24/7 news cycle world. We expect, we have immediate information, we expect immediate results. And at the end of the day, really sustainable change is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen because of a march or a tweet or a whatnot. You know what I mean? It's going to happen because of a long, sustained effort of bringing people together to create that change, right? So, that's one of the things that we believe. But honestly, it's a little hard to convince people of that. We've spent a long time really advocating this case, because so many people believe that you ought to see returns in the social world the same way you see returns in the business world, right? So we work with a lot of companies, a lot of corporate foundations. They invest in us, and that's a real trend we're seeing in a lot of nonprofit organizations. I don't know if you get any private sector corporate funding.
We wish.
Yeah, well, I can help you with that, because there's a lot of people interested in what you're talking about. But they want to see, immediate, right? And I think there's a great new, I think just a new sentiment that's emerging. And the head of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, who's a great guy, he's really talking about this and writing a lot about this idea that you can't use, the same metrics that you apply to business to look at social change. And it's like, that seems like a no-brainer, but as corporations enter into this space and really support this and see that it's good for their bottom line, they don't have the same patience they need to be able to have in this space. So anyway, that's what we do. We've supported to date about 15,000 women, but they're continuously in our network. And I'm going to actually tell you some of their stories and introduce you to some of them. But also, one of the things that I want to do with this is show you how I, personally, have learned some extraordinary lessons about leadership from these women. And I don't think they're lessons just for people in those countries. I think they're lessons for people anywhere. And I don't just think they're lessons for women. Because I think that the trends that we're seeing is that as more women come into positions of leadership, the way in which women lead, or let's say a feminine style of leadership, because I hate to say men and women, right? So a feminine style of leadership is different, but that difference is very much needed. So it's not necessarily better than a male style, it's different, but as we think about the kind of world that's evolving, that style of being more collaborative, being very, very motivated by cause. You know, we talked earlier about what motivates someone to stand up and want to make change and lead. And women tend to be very motivated by an experience, right? Something that happened to them. Not necessarily sort of, you know, saying, well, I'm you know, seeking, you know, power for the sake of power, and then once I get there, I'll do something good with it. It's really being centered in that, well, I'm stepping forward because of this. So, as I said, this is a more feminine style, not necessarily male or female, but as more women get into positions of leadership, more of that feminine style infiltrates, and it's something that we see as a trend that's emerging more and more. So, what I want to introduce you to is this leadership model. And really the first, it's got 5 parts to it. I'm happy to also share this presentation with you. You don't need to write down these things unless you want to. But the first is really that driving force. This, I don't need to talk to you about. You all know that leadership styles are evolving. But this is the idea of a driving force. And I talked about it when I first began speaking to you about having this sort of personal mission statement. And I think that's one of the things that right now, for the students around the table, this is the time to really think about that. What is not the mission statement of your NGO that you've started, right? Or the dialogue that you're developing, but like, what is the mission statement of your life? And that seems like, well, gee, that's a lot of pressure. But I think if you approach the way in which you're moving through the world in that way, you begin to see interesting patterns emerge of what it is that you're attracted to, what seems to be attracted to you, you know, and you can begin to see that, you know, maybe there's 6 words that could kind of define what I believe my legacy will be. Can I ask you, because I know you're a real activist, if you could describe your sort of driving force in like 6 words, not a paragraph, tell us what that would be.
I think it would be making the world safe for trans people of color.
You might even think about like, you know, even going a step beyond that of like, beyond safety, right? Because I'm sure safety is like the first step, and then like the next step is like, you know, appreciation, or, you know what I mean? Like what happens after that? And since you're young, you have a lot of time to implement this, so I'm sure safety will just be the first, and then...
Yeah, I would say safety, then inclusion, then celebration.
Mm-hmm. And I think probably like sort of recognizing the value, right? Like what value does that bring, you know? Because I think that will be, when people begin to see how it's in their interest to appreciate that and provide safety, even if it's like something that maybe is not in their immediate circle, but when they begin to see, oh, it's in my interest to do that, that's when the like mega shift will really happen, you know? Yeah. That it's not just like the human in me wants to make sure you're safe. It's more about, I see this as in my interest. I mean, I think that we've seen that definitely with women's issues, right? When we began to change the argument, it's not about protecting women's rights. It is, but it's also about the fact that if you leave half the population out, you can't compete in a global marketplace, right? Like if you choose not to educate women, if women are, you know, if violence against women is so, you know, present, you know, how do women go to work and, you know, be productive? So anyway, you know, I think that next hurdle.
I'm wondering though if that's like sort of like a problematic way to look at it, because like I can sort of see like why it's an interest to I guess like at the legislative level, but I think like at a personal or values base level, and I just say this because we are in international human rights class, and we're here really coming at that, like at this from that perspective, and like you have international human rights by virtue of you being human, nothing more, nothing less. You shouldn't have to benefit me in order for you to get these, in order for you to get X, Y, and Z. And so while I understand that when appealing to, I guess, like people in positions of power, however frustrating, it is important to, I guess, like appeal to the interests of those people like in power or those who represent people. But I guess I'm just like, it feels to me like very, like you'd be sacrificing a bit of your own sort of like values, like especially if this is like your personal mission statement, and if the value is like part of your personal mission statement, I guess it's like frustrating to me to have to convince you why it's important, because I shouldn't have to. Sorry.
No, it's a really valid point, and it is a very valid point, because how do you let go of the human rights element of it? I mean, I'll just speak about it from the women's perspective. I'd say about 10 years ago, the dialogue or the argument began to shift. And the argument shifted from this is the right thing to do to this is the smart thing to do, right? So it wasn't saying it's no longer the right thing, but it was saying this is right and smart, right? So I totally get your point, but I do also think that real sustainable change does not come just because a group of people who all agree, right? It comes because you convince the people who don't agree. And that's where you have to look at, well, how do I convince them and what are all the tools? So I get what you're saying, and believe me, I mean, I remember discussions that I would have even, you know, when I was very young and first getting into these issues with like, you know, my mother's generation feminists, and then saying to me, how could you possibly say that? You know, we have to be about the human rights argument. We are about human rights. But it did take hold because it was successful, and that's actually one of the things back in 2009 that we talked about a lot with a group of leaders from around the world who came together here at Villa La Pietra for a discussion about what is the argument that sticks, you know, and how do we begin to look at bringing, because we're going to only move so far working with the people who agree with us. We have to work with the people who don't agree with us now, because those are the minds and hearts that we have to change ultimately. So, but I totally get your point, and I respect it, and I think it's very valid, and we can't lose that, because I think eventually it is going to shift, and we can be much more about the rights. I mean, for example, when I started working on these issues, and I moved from the White House to the State Department, I was not allowed to use the word empowerment in any of the stuff that I would write, because it seemed too feministy. And this is the State Department, and we're trying to convince, you know, men in embassies around the world that they should care about this and why it's in their interest. And we needed data and proof. And up until about 15 years ago, we didn't have any research, because there wasn't money. Research is expensive. We didn't have any real data that said, if you educate a girl, families are healthier, right? Now we all know that, right? But we didn't have that research. The World Bank finally did that research, actually probably about 20 years ago. It's like until we had that, we couldn't convince this whole population, people who were like, oh, you women, oh, I know you want this, you know? But now it's like, oh, it's actually in our interest, you know?
Just to clarify, would you say that it's okay to have a personal mission statement that kind of differs from the mission statement that you're putting out to those that you're trying to convince? Just like Jordan was saying, that for her it's about safety, but then when you actually like put this personal mission into real actions, you present it as something a little bit different that will appeal to the rest of the public.
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, I don't think you even need to tell anyone your mission statement, your own personal mission statement. I mean, you can if you want, but I I don't think it's something that you're like publicizing out there. In fact, I mean, I purposely, a couple years ago, I wrote a book about Vital Voices in this leadership model, and I didn't actually talk about my own, driving force at all in the book, even though that's what I was talking about, all these women, because I really felt like that's kind of my own thing, and it's not even important. It's the thing that drives me and keeps me focused, and it's been a really powerful thing in my life, because for a long time I didn't even know that. It was in the back of my mind guiding me. I had this really formative experience, and it like put me on a path, and that's why I was there. And like every decision was evaluated against it, but I never really articulated like this is what it is. And then as I was going through the process of writing the book, I realized that. I was like, wow, like I've actually gone through that same thing that so many of these women have gone through, where they're just like, okay, that's it. This is, what I really want to be focused on. Do you have a question?
I think that a personal mission is always an evolution. I think, I don't know, that's my case anyway. I still really don't exactly have those 6 words to describe what I really want to do with my life. But one thing that I do struggle with is staying focused. Like, it's taken like a lot of effort to stay focused. And so I just wanted to ask you personally, what kind of tips do you have, or how do you stay focused on your personal mission and not get sidetracked by all these other things you can do when you're presented with so many other opportunities?
Honestly, I think the personal mission is what keeps you focused. So for example, over the course of my career, and certainly I think once you become the head of an organization, a lot of people will come to you and say, hey, do you want to run this organization? Or recruit you for different things. And, obviously it's always very flattering and, these great titles and whatnot. But it's like, I always evaluate, that's my like tool to say, okay, so right now at Vital Voices, I'm able to live out this mission of seeking power to empower other people. I mean, that's ultimately what we do. We're finding these amazing people and we're helping them to be more powerful. We're helping them to implement these massive dreams, not just for themselves, but their countries. And it's incredible. And I have this platform to be able to be as creative as I want to be and do that. So if I go to this place instead, will I be able to do that? If the answer is no, well, I stay where I am. Or am I only going there because my ego wants to go there and that's a big whatnot? But like, what is my mission? Because ultimately, I'm going to be successful and I'm going to be happiest where I can really live that. Because that's what I believe. That's where the passion comes from. But it's, I might not always work on women's issues, right? So, I mean, to me, it seems like your mission isn't necessarily, I want to work on, child marriage or education. I don't actually think that's your mission. To me, it's much more about, you realized kind of to whom much was given, much more was expected. I mean, and you were very pulled by that, like something really captured you. And you think about it, like not everyone, people that have that same experience, they don't decide to do that. They take a different path. So I think, leadership is very much about choice, and having an experience and then taking a step because of it. But I think, sure, your life's mission statement certainly can evolve and build. But it's not going to change as often probably as the mission of your organization. And it's probably going to build upon itself because you have further experiences. Yeah. Anyone else? No. Okay. So I want to just, this is a woman I was talking about earlier. She's actually the woman who really taught me about this idea of driving force. As I mentioned, this model, this leadership model that I'm going to share with you that's got 5 practices in it, it really emerged from these women. It was, if you will, sort of a crowdsourced via our network of women around the world, 144 countries model. And what began to happen is I realized that as I was working with so many women around the world, the most successful leaders were leading change in a certain way. And they had these common traits, whether it was like a graffiti artist in Brazil or, Sunitha in India, who's an activist working against human trafficking, that they had these commonalities. And once we began to kind of refine them down and call them out, more women began replicating them because they began to see, well, I don't think I'm a leader, but that woman's a leader, and actually I'm doing the same thing, so I guess I'll do it more. And I think that's sort of the value of kind of, capturing that crowdsourced knowledge. So this is Sunitha Krishnan, and she's from India. And she, when she was about 16, she was gang raped in India. And at the time, and certainly in many communities, this is still the case in India and in many places around the world, she was basically told, well, you should just go home and kill yourself because your life's over. Like, you'll never get married. It'll be very hard for you to get a job. No one's ever really going to take you seriously as a person. I mean, you're just ruined because of this incident, because it was so public within her community what had happened to her. It wasn't just that she was raped, she was gang raped, right? So she luckily had a very supportive mother who said, no, get up, go out, live your life. Don't let this define you. And she began to see that the most powerful thing in this world is emotion. And she had immense emotion following this experience. She had fear, and she had hate, and she had pain, and she had anger. And she thought, well, I can channel that in two ways. I can just be angry the rest of my life. I could potentially commit suicide. I could, leave this community, or I could actually focus on dealing with these issues. And so I remember when I was working on writing this book, I called her and I said, if I asked you what your driving force is, what would you say? And I didn't even say, here's what a driving force is, because I think it's like, it's self-explanatory, I guess. And she said, oh, it's harnessing the power in pain. She said, there is so much power in emotion. It's the thing that drives us, right? Whether it's love or it's anger, and how do you harness that power? Because that is the kind of power that changes the world. And so what she's harnessed that towards is she's created this shelter home for kids who were victims of violent, mostly sexual crimes. I went and visited, and she had, babies there. And she was telling me she had this one baby who had just been dropped off and by the police, and the baby was 3 months old. And she said, this baby is HIV positive. I said, really? Did the baby contract, the disease from its mother? And she said, no. This baby was basically sold into prostitution at birth. A 3-month-old baby, right? So, I mean, this is the kind of horrors that this woman is dealing with on a daily basis. She's threatened all the time. I think I told you she has 8,000 children. These are, the children in her shelter. She provides them with an education. She helps them get medical care. 98% of the kids are HIV positive. 98% of the kids in her shelter. So her goal is to, as she said to me, to give them a proper burial, if that's what it means, but also just to let them be kids for the rest of their lives as long as they're here. And she works with police. She's trained 25,000 police officers to understand what is human trafficking. Because in this community, they didn't really understand it, didn't recognize it. She helped to get a law passed. She helps to implement that law. So she's not just about, rescuing the survivors, but she is also about how do we just stop this? One of the things that I believe really strongly in is that we who care about these issues need to not only look at how do we protect victims or nurture, support survivors, or put the bad guys in jail, right? Or the bad women, because there's a lot of women who are involved in this as well. But how do we actually look at the root cause of why is this happening? And one of the things that Sunitha is working on is this issue of demand, demand for trafficking of babies. What is that about and why? And what is it in our society that, that says that that's okay? And so that's a big issue that she's working on. But she's, I think, one of the women who really helped me understand this idea of how powerful a driving force can be to really kind of be that true north as a leader. So this is the second practice that we've learned from women that we work with around the world, and this idea of strong roots in the community. So a driving force is, in my opinion, really the heart of where great leadership comes from. But then you have to really be rooted in that community or that constituency that you're leading, right? And so I was talking earlier about Vital Voices in our model. And one of the amazing things that I realized when I was working on the Vital Voices book is that all these lessons in leadership, not only have we learned them from women and have we shared them with other women, but we actually took them on. And we were a product of these lessons. Our organization, our culture, and the way that we think about things and the way that we interact and do things was really driven by this. So when I was telling you about how we go into communities and we don't say, well, here are the problems, you know, we're going to bring the solutions from the United States or wherever, right? We go into communities, we find the people who are bringing those solutions and we support them so that they can accelerate their efforts. Because that's where we believe real change is coming from. And now, having been doing this work for 20 years, we can prove it. And we're actually doing some really exciting research right now with Melinda Gates and her new pivotal ventures. I don't know if you've heard about this. She started a new venture because she wanted to work on women's issues, which is awesome. And she's supporting a lot of data and research because she believes that you've got to have the data to make the argument. And so we're really looking at how philanthropic efforts aimed at development need to totally turn on their head. We have to stop looking at sort of a mile wide, inch deep. And, you know, as I mentioned before, corporations are very much about, because they may not be able to see change, they've now become very much about numbers and scale, right? So they want you to reach thousands of women. And we're like, no, we're going to reach 10. And those 10 women are going to reach thousands of people. Right, and so it's really, you know, we're coming up with the data that shows that strategic long-term investments are the only things that actually make change. And when I say investments, I mean focus, work, right? And so, you know, this is some. It'll be some. Maybe we can come back and share that research when we have it. We should have it in. Oh, it's frustrating to me. I've been wanting it, but it's not going to be here for like 8 months. But anyway, so the idea of strong roots in the community is this idea that empathy is probably one of the most important traits that a leader has, which is like kind of crazy because if you think about it, like empathy is like, well, that's a soft skill. Like, how could that be the skill of a leader? But if you can't put yourself in someone else's shoes, you can't expect to lead them. And if you can't have that empathy for them, they don't want to be led by you, right? I mean, that is what people are craving right now. They're craving that connectivity. So this idea of listening being a leadership skill, right? I mean, most people, like traditional models of leadership, they're the talker. But actually, like what we've really seen, and certainly research support this, is that listening is probably one of the most important skills as well. So it's really having those roots in the community. And I'll just give you a little example, kind of building on this idea of not going into a community and saying, well, here are the problems and we've got the solutions. Because I think this is really important as you kind of go out into your career and think about making change. And so I want you to have this story with you. And in the Vital Voices book, I talk a bit about this. A number of years ago, there was a water crisis in Bangladesh. So this has nothing to do with Vital Voices. This is a story I'm telling you so that to kind of get this concept of the importance of local knowledge and culture. So there's a water crisis in Bangladesh, and there's a problem where the water was contaminated from these wells. And the wells were built by the international community, so the international community comes back in, whoever it might be, whatever organization it was, and they basically decide, well, we're gonna test all the water well and make sure, that everything's okay. And unfortunately, they found that a lot of the water wells had arsenic in them because of the way that the piping was done and not understanding the soil and some other things, okay? This is done by the international community. So they say, oh, well, we've got a perfect solution. In the communities where we test the water and it's bad, we will paint those wells red so that people will know. And in the communities where the water is good and safe, we'll paint those wells green. And then we'll spend millions upon millions of dollars on a campaign teaching people the difference between red and green, right? That red is bad and green is good, okay? So they do this. So what happens? Well, there's this weird rise of violence against women, of child marriage, and of human trafficking. So you know what happened? What happened is that in the communities where there were water wells, the women and girls in those communities were seen as, you know, it was part of their dowry, the water well. They were seen as like, you know, in high commodity, whatever you want, very valuable. And all of a sudden, if that well is painted red and that's contaminated, that woman is contaminated because that's what the culture believed. And so those women, you know, are then sold because the family, you know, needs to have something, right? And so they basically sell off their daughters because they can't, you know, they're not going to get married and they have no future, right? Because they are they're on contaminated land, so they must be contaminated, okay? Then, because that's so terrible, people start painting over the red with green. And so really, like, you know, nobody can tell anything anymore, right? So this is a multi-million-dollar, multi-year solution that never consulted the local culture or people or understood what the water wells meant to them. And in fact, none of those people were around the table. You know, you think about the value of leadership that is informed by not only an individual and being able to put themselves in their shoes, but being informed even by that local culture and what people in those communities feel and why that's such an important sort of leadership skill and in making change. This is Buthaina Camel. No one here's from Egypt, are they? No. Buthaina is from Egypt. And, you know, as you obviously will remember, back in 2011, 2012, during the Arab uprising, you know, women and men took to the streets. I mean, for so many women, and we were talking about this earlier, it was the first time that they'd been part of a protest. And, you know, they're standing shoulder to shoulder with men and, you know, feeling like, okay, now we know this is what, you know, equality tastes like and feels like. And they got a taste of that, and she decides, okay, I'm going to run for president. And she's the only woman who decides, you know, that she's going to run. A lot of other candidates. And she's also the only candidate that does something very different. She actually travels all over the country on sort of a listening tour to hear from the people. And she believes that, you know, it was the people that called for this revolution. So anyone who represents, you know, the people and their voice has to have, you know, their voice in their ear, if you will. She didn't win. I don't know if you remember. She came to La Pietra. Yeah. And you know, and that was just before she ran. But yeah, that's how we first met her. This is Musakua. I can't remember. She might have come one year. She's from Cambodia. And she left Cambodia during the Pol Pot regime and the Khmer Rouge. Her family put her on a plane to Paris. Then she made her way to the United States, to San Francisco, and she never saw them again. And when she returned, she found a completely different Cambodia. And she began to realize that, you know, in the wake of, you know, terrible destruction and disaster and this mass genocide, what had happened with peacekeepers coming is this rise of human trafficking. And, you know, she began really working on that issue. She's now an elected parliamentarian. She's actually the leader of the opposition party in her country, in Cambodia. And every time I reach her, she's, you know, out in the field somewhere, and I'm always like, what are you doing, you know? You hear this grass crinkling, and she's like, oh, you know, I'm walking the campaign trail. And I'm like, what do you mean? When's your election? You know, didn't you just win? And she's like, oh, but, you know, this is what I do. You know, I have to know, what does it feel like to have your child, you know, taken from you, or to have your land grabbed by the government and been told that it was never yours even though you paid for it and have the deed. So she's someone who, you know, really reminds me so much of this idea of having those strong roots in the community and how important that is as a leader, never to feel as though you're up here, but to always know you're here, kind of lifting those and understanding those beneath you, or, you know, that you're leading. So this is the third practice of the leadership model that we've learned. It's the idea of being able to connect across lines that divide. And this, I think, is really important, back to what we were talking about earlier, the idea of understanding what motivates people that are different than you, or people who believe things completely different. So, you know, right now people are really craving for leaders that are able to work with people who they agree with on one issue, but maybe disagree with on every other issue. And so it's about finding those commonalities and common ground. And, you know, if you look around the world, there's so many examples of how women have led change and brought about the infrastructure within a community that supported a peace accord. Like in Northern Ireland, I was mentioning earlier that, you know, in 1976, 2 women won the Nobel Peace Prize, a Protestant and a Catholic, for being the first to cross the lines that were dividing that society in the Civil War. And they were like, you know what, enough. You know, I don't want my sons or, you know, fathers or brothers dying in this bloody Civil War. You know, we have to find common ground. We have to see, what do we agree upon? We want safety, we want health care, we want education. We don't want our children leaving, you know, once, you know, they've got to go off to college and never come back because there's no industry here, there's no jobs here. So how do we work together across those common areas? We certainly see that in the United States, you know. Anytime there's a government shutdown, it's usually kind of the women back-channeling, you know, working with each other, trying to figure out, okay, how do we get this going again? I'm sure you have experience with that. But it is the idea of, you know, sustainable change doesn't just come from working with people who agree with you. You have to figure out, if you want to make breakthrough real change, it is about convincing the other side. So, for example, you know, it's not just about the march, it's about what comes after the march and what came before the march. And, you know, the march is just this, you know, the symbolism of the whole thing. And I think it's, you know, it's about knowing when to raise your voice, but most of the time it's about understanding what motivates the other side and figuring out where that common ground is. This is Inez McCormick, who I was talking about before, from Northern Ireland. One of the things that she would always say to me, and she really taught us this lesson, is she would say, you know, every time you go into a room, if you call yourself a human rights leader, the first thing you have to think about is the human rights of someone who you completely disagree with and their rights, right? And she'd always say, the first question you should ask yourself is who's not at the table. Not who's at the table, but whose voice isn't being heard. And that's, you know, something that she thinks a lot about, just this idea of, okay, you know, yeah, this person agrees, but like, who's the one person who's not at the table who doesn't agree? How do I bring that person in? Because if I can bring that person in, this idea, this change might actually have traction. And, you know, we've been, with Vital Voices, the way we've taken in this lesson is everything that we do it in partnership. We never, you know, just work independently. But also we think about, well, who are the unlikely guests at the dinner party, right? I mean, you know how you go to a dinner party and like there's someone there you weren't expecting, and it always makes for the more interesting conversation because you know all those people and you know what they have to say and you know what they do. But this person, that's an interesting, you know, they're going to bring an interesting element and take the conversation in a new and different direction. So the fourth practice of the leadership model is this idea that bold ideas are great, but they have to be put into action, right? And so what does that action really look like? And, you know, one of the things that we've really found working with women around the world is that they think very much outside the box because they've never been in the box. They don't know what it looks like. They haven't had the sort of traditional straight line to make change. They've had to like go around and find a window and break it in the back, you know, because they couldn't go in the front door. And so we've really kind of looked at the value of bold and innovative, kind of out-of-the-box thinking to make breakthrough change. And so this is a great example of this. This is Pamela Castro. She's from Brazil. She's a graffiti artist. I don't know if anyone speaks Portuguese here, but that says fight like a woman. So she lives in Rio, and she grew up in the favelas, in the slums of Rio. And when she was growing up, violence against women, domestic violence in particular, I mean, it was just commonplace. It was just sort of, the way things were. It was just part of culture. And she was married, and she was in a violent relationship, and she was able to get out of that relationship. And she started really doing her art when she got out to kind of find herself again and her voice. And she started actually doing murals in the street. And then she learned that there was a law on the books that said that domestic violence was a crime. And it was actually created for this woman who was shot by her husband and paralyzed, the Maria da Penha, that's her name, Maria da Penha law in Brazil. But she knew also that people in the favelas where she grew up didn't know about it. Well, it turns out a lot of people didn't know about that law, including the police, or what it even meant, right? Okay, well, we have a law, but so, this is culture, right? This is the way things are. So she decided that she would basically do whatever she could do. And this is, I think, just a great mark of leadership, is not to wait until you've got all the right tools, but just to do what you have from wherever you are with whatever you've got. I mean, it's why you started your organization at age 16, Like, you might have said, well, when I get out of college and I've got all the right education, or when I find the right mentor, or I raise some money, like, the perfect situation to create change will never come. Like, the most important thing to know is that you cannot wait for an invitation. It will never come. So what she did is she took to the streets, she started making these murals, this graffiti art. And I heard about her, and I went down to Brazil, and I traveled all over the city, and she was telling me about the artwork that she's done, and sort of some things that have happened in these communities because of it, and how she's doing all this work to empower girls. I said, oh my gosh, you are pioneering this amazing model of leadership. This is amazing. She's like, what are you talking about? I'm just a girl doing graffiti in the street. I'm definitely not a leader. But now she's become part of our network. She's someone we've been investing in for the last, I met her in 2009, so, the last 8 years or so. And she has traveled all over the world. She has shared her model in the United States. She's shared her model in Israel. And she has been very successful, more successful than, millions of dollars of, campaigns that have been developed by international NGOs to try and figure out how you implement this law. She's been the one who's created the traction because she has infiltrated people at a different way. We were talking earlier about how, emotion and the arts are so powerful in shaping the way that we behave. So much more powerful in shaping the way that we behave than a newspaper article or a politician giving a speech. We don't change our behavior because of that, I mean, it's actually, I think, one of the silver linings of the recent election in the United States. It isn't one person that creates change. It's mass movements. It's mass people, in a country around the world stepping up and saying, you know what, it's time to make change. So I think, to me, that's very, very exciting. And I think one of the things that, I've really been struggling with is, okay, how do we take that fervor that exists right now for activism, and particularly for activism around gender issues? How do we take that and move it forward? There is great energy, and what's wonderful to see is that it's not just something that's happening in the United States, it really is around the world. So one of the things that we were talking about earlier was, might there be an opportunity to kind of explore this idea further, both with activists like the ones that I've been introducing you to around the world who've been doing this work for 20, 10, 30 years, and also students that are here, and to say, how do we take advantage of people saying right now, I want to make change, but I don't know how? Like, what do we, we all have certain things that we do. How do we build something that people can be part of and that people can understand what it's going to take, to move things forward? I really believe that culture and the arts are probably the only thing that will actually change culture and behavior. I think culture to shift can be a powerful tool in shifting culture. That's why I think what Pamela is doing, like when I saw what she was doing, I was like, we have to figure out how to amplify you. And she's, you know, this was something that she was sort of doing, you know, just in the streets, you know, and now she's really being recognized around the world, as I said, and this is, you know, a phenomenal model. So the last story or practice I want to share with you is something that I would not believe if I hadn't seen it. And this is this idea that people who seek power, I think, tend to understand that the only meaningful measure of power is the extent of its positive impact. And so one of the things that we really find with a lot of women that we work with is that once we invest in them, you know, and support them, they immediately look around in their community, in other places, in other networks, and say, okay, who can I invest in, who can I mentor? And that's really the power of investing in leaders and investing in individuals, is that they will then go on and invest in other people and mentor other people. And that's one of the core things that we do at Vital Voices is mentorship. And I know, you know, mentorship, it's a word that's thrown out a lot. It's like, what does that mean? Oh, isn't sponsorship more important? But I see mentorship as extremely valuable. I mean, I would not be in my job if I was not mentored. You know, yes, I've been with this organization for 20 odd years, but you know, I was always the young activist running around the world, you know, meeting these women, working with them. I wasn't the person who was leading the organization. And, you know, I was really lucky to have a great mentor, Milan Verveer, who left Vital Voices. She was the CEO and chair of Vital Voices, the organization, you know. And then she left to become the first ever global ambassador for women and girls at the State Department when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And when she left, I was then president, but she was CEO, you know, so I didn't work with our board directly. I wasn't, you know, the head of the organization. I was running the programs and running things in the office. And she said, you know, this is, you know, and she had told me this before. She says, you know, one day, you know, we're going to turn this organization over to you. You know, you've been doing this. But she really, I think, saw leadership in me before I saw it in myself. You know, I never actually imagined running it. I mean, I've now been doing that since 2009, but, you know, I really didn't, because I always thought, oh, it's someone of my mother's generation, you know, and I'll always be the sort of activist running around the world, the young one. Because, you know, a lot of people, you know, they'd known me for 20 years, they met me when I was 21, you know, so I was that person. So I think you know, the thing I want to definitely say is find someone that you admire and respect and just connect yourself with them. Don't say, oh, will you be my mentor? Because it doesn't really work that way. I think just find ways to, you know, to bring them into your universe. You know, people that, you know, you admire, go and intern for people, you know, find ways to connect with people. But real mentorship happens when someone recognizes potential in you, you know, and gets behind your idea. And the reason they're so critical is they're not just your cheerleaders. You know, they're really the people who also are going to say, okay, that was a failure, but pick yourself up and what did you learn from it and move forward. So this last story, well, almost last story I want to share with you, this is Kenya and Taya, and she's really the one who just taught me this idea of paying it forward, and how so many of the women we work with really seek power to empower other people. She grew up in a small village in Kenya, in the Masai Mara. I don't know if many of you have traveled there. It's, you know, beautiful place to go on safari. But, you know, just below the surface in these communities in the Masai Mara, and she grew up in Anusayan, girls at very early age are promised off to be married. And then as soon as they, you know, have their first period, they basically are pulled out of school. So they, you know, let's say 12 or 13, they're no longer going to school. They go through the practice of female genital cutting or mutilation. And then that's basically the end of the life that they would have chosen for themselves. So no more school, you know, now they're married, probably by the time they're 14, they're having a baby, maybe even younger. And she looked at that life and saw that life around her and was like, that's not the life that I want. I don't know how she knew that there'd be another possibility, but somehow she did. And she learned that, and I can't remember, did she come to La Pietra? I think she did. Yeah. So she decided that she had one negotiating tactic with her father, and that was that if she did not go through the practice of FGM, it would be a huge shame on her family and the community, like to know that there was a girl who didn't go through this. So she said to her father, okay, if you let me stay in school, I'll go through this practice. But if you won't let me stay in school and you promise me off to be married, then, you know, I'm going to run away and I won't go through that practice. And so, you know, the way to not bring shame on our family would be to have me go through the practice, but then I'll stay in school. And he agreed. And then by the time she was done with school and looking at universities in the United States, and somehow she managed to get herself a scholarship at a university in Pennsylvania. And now all she needed was a one-way ticket, you know, out of the Masai Mara. She'd never left her home community. She'd never even been to Nairobi, right? She never left. And she, at that point, her father, who was an alcoholic and was sick and had died, and she knew now that the other men in the village were now her fathers. And so she decided that she would get up really early in the morning and go to each of their houses and ask them if they would give her money and give their permission for her to get on this plane and go and take this scholarship. And she knew that according to the culture, if you get up and bring someone news early in the morning before the sun rises, you can only bring good news. So she followed that rule, understanding how important culture was. She did that, and they agreed, and she cobbled together the money and got on the flight. And I remember she was telling me that when she got on that plane, there was only one person standing there to see her off, and that was her mother. You know, the one person who thought, you know, I believe in you, you know, go forth, right? No, everybody, okay, we'll let you go, but, you know, we're not sure how we feel about this. So fast forward, it's 2007, 2006. And I meet her at this conference. Someone introduces us. She's just a dissertation away from her PhD in education. And we started talking, and I would tell her about Vital Voices, and she says, well, I have a dream, and I need your help. I have a debt to pay back. I want to go back to my village in Kenya, and I want to build the first ever girls' school, a place where girls can continue their education, and they can also be safe, because one of the reasons they'd take girls out of school is because it wasn't safe to go to school after they might be raped on the way to school, they might end up getting pregnant, all these things, right? So only girls were allowed to be in school. You know, by the time you're 12 or 13, you couldn't be. So she wanted to have a dormitory there for the girls to be able to learn and dream. And the way that, you know, Vital Voices works, we meet people and it's like a gut instinct. You know, my sort of measure if we're going to invest in someone and support them is, do I feel like I want to move to their country and help them with that? You know, like, okay, I really believe in you, this is amazing. And so at the time when we met her, you know, she had this amazing story, she hadn't done anything yet. And we began supporting her. We built her first website. We built a whole group of people that traveled with her out to Africa, you know, to Kenya, planes, trains, automobiles, all the way to get there, you know, really the middle of nowhere. And we're there for the groundbreaking of the school. And we'd help to raise money and bring support. And I remember when we were planning this delegation visit, I thought, oh, I need really powerful women to go. And, you know, we're gonna have this woman from Africa and this woman from Europe. And, you know, we're planning this. And when we got there, I realized, like, nobody knows who these women are. You know, we're in the middle of nowhere, you know. But I think what meant so much to them is that we came. And that, like, why did all these women come from all over the world? And they were very proud. Every single man in the village that day told me that he was, you know, her father, her brother, her uncle. You know, I mean, like, everybody was related to her. You know, everybody wanted to be connected to her. Basically, they weren't all actually related to her, which to me was success, right? Because it's all about culture. And they were proud, you know, of this girl who left and then came back and fulfilled this promise. So in her school now, as you can see, she's got the school, and those are a lot of the kids that are in her school. Has 300 kids in the school, all living on campus. She also does workshops for communities and for families. Every single girl who is in this school, their parents have to sign on to an agreement that they won't go through female genital cutting, and that they also will not be promised off to be married before age 18. And I said to her, I said, well, how did you do that? Because that's cultural change. I mean, how does that come about? And she said, you know what it is? People see me now as a village elder because I fulfilled my promise. Like, they see me as a wise person. They want their daughters to be like me. So, if I say this is what you're going to do, they believe me and they do it. It's pretty amazing. And that's one of the way in which we measure impact is not just did she set out what she was going to do, build that school, but, she also, was able to shift culture. Her model is now being replicated all over the world, so she travels all over the world. She was a CNN hero now. She was a explorer in residence at National Geographic. She's won awards by Diane von Furstenberg. She speaks at the Clinton Global Initiative and at Women in the World in New York. And, she's really sort of touted as this leader who really broke through, not just in creating educational opportunities for girls, but also really in shifting culture and how does that get done. And so I think she really showed me this power of, if you invest in the right people, they will not just make something happen, they will reach back out and build other leaders as well. They will have this great desire to give back. And that's sort of that multiplier effect of I think, investing in leaders, but also, in my case, particularly in women leaders. So that's the leadership model. I want to share with you this one last story. I'm sure you all know who this is, Aung San Suu Kyi. As you probably know, she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. 1989, she was put under house arrest because she ran for president. Her father was a great general and leader in Burma. At that time, Burma was, the rice bowl of Asia, very well educated, people lived good lives. And then, basically in 1989, she returned to the country. The military put her under house arrest, annulled the election that she won, landslide victory, and she remained there until just recently, till 2011. She would come out but for the most part, for the last 20 years, she was under house arrest. And right when she was released, I went to go and visit her. And actually, this is how my husband and I met, who you might meet if he comes in a little bit. He helped me sneak in to meet her. So in 2011, she's just been released. Actually, end of 2010, she was released. And I go to meet her because we at Vital Voices do an event where we honor women leaders each year. And we were going to be honoring her, but we knew she wouldn't be coming out of the country because if she did, they wouldn't let her back in. And you all know her story, right? You know about how she remained, quite frankly, she is so powerful, and the people have so much love for her as the leader that at any time she could have said, okay, people revolt, and they would have. There would have been a coup, absolutely. But she believed very strongly in this sort of silent resistance and peaceful resistance. And so she remained under house arrest for, as I say, about 20 years. And then she decided that she would begin to speak out. Now, interesting, now she's a parliamentarian, really actually sort of the number 2, or basically sort of running the country again, which is kind of amazing. Interesting, because she goes from being an icon for peace under house arrest to now being a politician, which is a very interesting transition. And that's why I think, it's important to think about how leadership is really a journey. It's not a final destination. It's a constant shifts along the way. But one thing that she said to me, and the reason why I wanted to share her story with you, is when I met her, I said, you're such an extraordinary leader. You have all these women around the world who admire you that I work with, and I just wonder if you have a message for them. And well, first she said, well, I'm not really a leader. I'm just, a person who gets up every day and does the right thing. I'm like, well, that's kind of the definition, It's a pretty good one. Anyway, and then she said, I think there's a difference. This is her message for the women that we work with around the world. She said, the difference between good intentions and great leadership is the courage and commitment to stay the course, no matter how difficult the path. To me, she obviously exemplifies that in 20 years. She was able to bring about change, but it took 20 years. And, I think it's deceptive, I think, in this world in which you're, coming into and living in and working in and so forth, because so much is changing and we see the change through technology and social media, et cetera, but it's not actually, real change, real sustainable change takes a very long time. So I want to, in the little bits of remaining, people talk throughout. I want to kind of open it up if anyone wants to share or ask questions, but also one of the things that I would love to know from all of you is how do people like me or other people around the table who've worked on these issues for so many years, the issues of advancing women or other issues that I think have been under attack, how do we take advantage of this moment where in the United States, but also around the world, people are wanting to see positive change and getting ignited and engaged now more than ever? How do people who've been doing this work for 20 years, slogging along, now there's it's like a wave of interest. How do we use that? How do we get people engaged? How do we help them find their own paths? I think that's one of the things that, I've been really, kind of struggling with is that concept. So I don't know if anyone around the table, or if you want to make another comment or anything.
I think one of the first steps is making people realize that it's possible. I worked with a group of students that was doing arts-based workshops in Rikers with 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And during my workshop, we were talking about the ways that we could, this was before Donald Trump was elected, very close to the election, I think late October. And we were talking about the ways that we could change the world to kind of prevent what Donald Trump might do. And a lot of the boys were talking about how they wanted to end jail and close Rikers. And they had no idea that all of us were involved in the campaign to close Rikers, and that now it's been promised that it will be closed. And so I think getting them to understand that it's possible and that the work is already happening is the first step, and then making that accessible to them, because they had no idea that it was happening or how to even imagine a world where Rikers could be closed. And so kind of what my major is using imagination and the way that people tell stories and create these entire new worlds to help people understand that there is a way of imagining the world that doesn't exist right now, where every change that we want is possible. And so how do we use that to be the model for the real on the ground work that we're doing?
It was just kind of a really interesting comment.
Yeah, I was just responding to what you said.
Thank you for that great presentation. As you were speaking, a couple things you hit on that I think we might, what I'm seeing a little bit differently now is, has some sociological and economic parallels, but the idea that it isn't about winning an election or winning a certain issue or referendum. And I think it's been set up that way, and I think that very much fits the short-term results model of instant gratification that is pushed. But there are all sorts of sociological trends about particularly millennials and I know there's sort of a debate on when that begins and when it ends, but the sort of feedback that we're getting from millennials is that some of the motivating incentives of career path are fading. They're willing to, when asked, would I be willing to accept 50% of my pay if I had a meaningful job? Like, it's tripled since like 1990 to now. And I think, and there's also all sorts of consumer research about the experience economy. And so I think there are all these trends that suggest that the narrative you're pushing I find very compelling, and it's one I grew up with because my father was a very politically active person who supported all the losing candidates for years. But what I saw in that was that he didn't, it is a lifelong thing, and I think plugging that narrative and moving people through art and cultural means is a way to sort of shift the narrative to some sort of authentic, meaningful experience that takes a long time, and that's where it has. And I think people who got politically active were suddenly realizing, it's cool to go and protest, but it's also, it's good to, get your voice heard, but you don't win and you wonder what happens afterwards, but you take something away from that political action that is greater than yourself. And that's not something that we have a lot of experiences, at least in the US, of having. With strangers in your community, you get together and you have something in common. And I think politics and those types of things sort of fit into these, this melange of things I'm mentioning. But I think there are a lot of things pointing in that direction. So this totally chimes with that.
Oh, good. Yeah, I think you're right. I feel like, okay, for 20 years, more than that for me, but for Vital Voices, for 20 years, we've been kind of doing the same thing, approaching things the same way. And it's like, how do we break the logjam on these issues? We've moved forward, but like the issue of violence against women, actually, that's getting worse. I was sharing earlier, there's this study that was done that looks at how there's all this violence in the media, not like the news, or newspaper. It's our entertainment, what we're consuming as entertainment, and how violence has stayed flat, but violence against women has gone up by 66%, and violence against girls has gone up by 200%, over 200%. So, this is, the media and our entertainment is shaping also society, or vice versa. It's all, feeding on each other. So I think the arts can be really, really powerful. Arts, entertainment, can be really powerful in shaping behavioral change. Because ultimately, that's what you're talking about. It's not about the one law, the one this. It's like, how will people interact and behave with each other, and how do you change that? There's this wonderful African proverb that says that if you want to understand culture, listen to the stories. If you want to change culture, change the stories. So it's like, how do you begin to do that? And I think the arts and things can be a powerful tool in that. You're going to share your driving force. Oh, just kidding. I'm kidding.
I was just going to add on to what you were saying, because I did a forum on human trafficking, finding solutions is a thing that I've been doing for the past 2 years now, and I wanted to always just try to find a way to kind of communicate to people in my local community, where a lot of these things were actually happening just right next door in schools, and how people would see these girls go into cars and they wouldn't know anything that was happening to them. And so kind of trying to explain to them that, there's something that you can do. You can be a witness. You can help the local law enforcement find these girls and things like that. I think that creating smaller things in my community at least has helped more people to get more involved. And I think also just finding ways to kind of invest, as you said, I really related to that, because investing in smaller coalitions, especially finding leaders in the community, was a really big thing. Yeah. And I think that within certain communities, I think that's lacking. And I think that's just something that to keep in mind, as well as looking at the media with looking at a lot of rap songs or certain things that are talking about women in these kind of derogatory ways, and being kind of reciprocated by these young men who are learning about these kind of issues and things. So.
I have two somehow distinct comments, and one I think, was very interested by what you said. I think, somehow it connects with what you said before, that is about the demand. No? When you're working on trafficking, and you try also to find out who's actually, creating the demand for the women trafficked. So my question is, as I do not do it personally, I just study those things, but I can see that there are a lot of campaigns on women that are victims of violence, how to rehabilitate the women. I remember I visited some great places in Bosnia where they rehabilitate the victims, and so we do in Italy, etc., etc. Question is, very seldom I've found that I know campaigns that rather are targeting either the demand for trafficking, the demand for prostitution, the demand for sex tourism, or even men that are committing violence. And I wonder if perhaps it isn't also the time to also begin, this kind of new kind of action. The other comment that I had was about the exemplary individual. Because it seems to me that you're investing, as you're saying, you're investing a lot on exemplary individuals, and it seems, from what I hear, that this is successful because then those individuals, they have a kind of, spillover function.
Right.
But sometimes I wonder, first of all, how do you make sure that somehow then this individual really has a spillover function that really becomes transformative leadership rather than becoming, more traditional form of leadership? And also, whether, as Vital Voices, do you also invest in collectives? Because, it is true that it is important to have the exceptional individual that gives the great example. But also what is needed in activism is this kind of, daily, perhaps, none of us can be as fantastic of those women, but change is also brought about by normal, decent people that perhaps do not become God knows what, but somehow they transform their life in a very, very simple way. So also, how do you invest in the collective?
In terms of investing in the collective, one of the other pieces that we do, in addition to investing in individuals, but we also connect them to each other, and then, look at how they can come together to push for change. But another thing that we do is look at how do we just level the playing field. So we have a lot of advocacy campaigns that we're part of, that we engage people in. So we do absolutely believe in that. The third piece, I'd say, one of the ways that we often will support an individual is to train and support their number two. Because one of the things that we find is that, there's that one person and they're just giving everything, and they don't really have a number two who's well trained. They can't leave the shelter in India to go and raise money in the United States and speak about it, because who's going to be there to run it, right? So we'll support her by training maybe a couple people within her organization. So we do believe very strongly in the individual, and I think there are other great organizations that are much more about the collective, but we do advocacy work with them and then in their communities. One of the things that we do, for example, we have a couple global activation days. One day is on March 8th, we do a global mentoring walk all over the world. So we always do it the Saturday after, but we basically use International Women's Day for women leaders to walk with emerging leaders and mentor them over the course of the day, and then usually it leads to further mentoring. But anyway, that's one of the things that we do. But we also do a program where we hold this ceremony in New York, but we, through our network and all our chapters around the world, they hold local versions of this as well, and it's called our Voices of Solidarity, where we honor men who are working to end violence against women. And so we have basically a group of men each year that we honor and hold up. And I think one of the things that we've been really trying to do is look at what role men can play, and that's one of the things you were talking about earlier, and how I think us as the people who care about these issues and the activists who work on these issues, maybe one fault in the past we haven't created a space for men to actually lead in this community. And so that's one of the things that we're really trying to do, is kind of showcase these great men. Like, for example, the last awards, we always do it during the 16 days of activism to end violence against women, which is from the end of November to the 10th of December, which is International Human Rights Day. And for example, we we honored this year these two guys, young guys, 24 years old, who created nail polish. It's called Undercover Colors. And when you dip it in a drink, if that drink is laced with, some sort of date rape drug, then it turns a color. And it's two guys, 24 years old, engineers, who basically were personally affected when a friend of theirs was, a victim of a date rape through, something like this. And so they decided we're gonna try and do something. It's just these two guys. So, and then we also honored, the new Secretary General of the United Nations. So we kind of have all levels. We've also honored former U.S. Vice President Joe Biden on the work he did, on the Violence Against Women Act so many years back. So we really want to show, at all levels, everywhere in society, whether you're, the head of the UN or, a country, or you're, guys who just saw a problem and wanted to address it with the skills that you had, you can make a difference. So the one idea I just want to leave you with that I think is really just important as you go off and you think about, your life and what you're going to do, and hopefully you think more about your driving force, is that when you think about making change, you don't look at the ways that necessarily other people have made change who've come before you. Because what we need right now is for you to bring your lens and your experience. So we need you to learn from what's happened in the past, but we need you to take it a step forward, because, your generation and your experiences is a totally unique endeavor, right? And as I mentioned, there's a logjam on a lot of these issues. And if we don't have some of that new ideas and that new synergy to break it, we won't. Right? So don't do what all the other people before you have done, but do know that it takes time. So thank you all.
Thank you.